She was 21 years old, and they gave her until the end of October to be gone. Not because she had done anything wrong. Not because there was any law that said she had to go. But because her stepfather's new wife had made it clear, in the way that certain women make things clear without ever raising their voice, that the house on Callaway Road was no longer a place where Delia Crane belonged. We want to tell you about Delia, not the version of her that existed at the end of this story, the woman who would eventually be spoken of with something up close to reverence in the town of Horwick, Montana. But the version that stood on the porch of that farmhouse on a cold Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1886, holding everything she owned in a canvas sack and a leather satchel that had once belonged to a man named Orrin Fitch. Orrin Fitch had been the town cobbler. He had also been, for the 6 years between Delia's mother's first illness and her death, the closest thing to a real father that Delia had ever known. Not by blood, not by law, just by the quiet, daily fact of showing up. Letting her sit on the stool in the corner of his shop after school, handing her scraps of leather to practice with, teaching her the difference between a welt seam and a turn shoe, explaining why the grain of the hide mattered, why the all-angle mattered, why everything that was worth doing with attention. Orrin Fitch had died of a lung infection the previous February. He had left her his tools. His family had not been pleased about that. His nephew, a man named Douglas Fitch, who managed a dry goods concern in Billings and visited Harwick exactly twice a year, had come to the shop 2 weeks after the funeral and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and a particular expression on his face. The expression of a man who believes he is being patient, when in fact he is simply being slow about his contempt. "The business goes to me," Douglas Fitch had said. "That was always understood." "I know," Delia had told him. "The inventory, the lease, the customer accounts. I know that too." He had looked at the satchel on the workbench, the old one, dark brown leather gone soft with age, the brass clasp worn smooth, and she had seen his eyes move to it and then away, the way a man's eyes move when he has decided something is beneath him to argue over. She had picked it up before he could change his mind. That satchel was on her shoulder now, along with the canvas sack, as she walked away from her stepfather's house on Callaway Road. Her stepfather, Roy Alderman, stood in the doorway and did not say goodbye. His wife, a woman named Frances Alderman, who had been Frances Gould of Bozeman before the wedding 6 months ago, stood just behind him and looked at a point somewhere past Delia's left ear. "There's a place up the North Fork," Roy said finally. "Old surveyor's cabin. It belonged to a fellow who went back east, never came back. I don't know who holds the deed now. Might be no one." Delia looked at him. "It's not much," he said, "but it's shelter." That was the most he had ever done for her. She understood that. She picked up her bags and she walked north. "We should tell you something about the North Fork of Harwick Creek in late October." The aspens had already dropped their leaves by then, and the ground was the color of old copper, and the sky had that particular quality of Montana autumn sky. Very high and very cold and very blue, the kind of blue that looks beautiful and means nothing kind. The road, such as it was, turned to 2 ruts in the frozen mud after the first mile, and then to a suggestion of a path, and then to nothing at all. She walked for 3 hours. The cabin, when she found it, was a single room maybe 14 feet square, with a stone chimney that had partially collapsed on one side, a door that hung crooked on its hinges, and a window with the glass gone and the gap stuffed with old burlap. The floor was packed dirt. There was a rusted wood stove in the corner, a sleeping shelf built into the wall, and a workbench along the back. Solid, hand-built, better than anything else in the room. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. A lesser person might have sat down and cried. Delia Crane set down her bags, looked at the chimney, looked at the stove, looked at the window, and began to take stock. There was half a cord of wood stacked under a lean-to around the side, old but dry. The stove, when she opened it, was intact inside. The chimney was collapsed only at the top, which meant the flue was probably still clear. The burlap in the window was better than nothing. The door could be rehung with a little work. The sleeping shelf would hold her weight. She had a bedroll, 2 changes of clothes, a skinning knife, a small tin of matches, 3 biscuits wrapped in a cloth, a wedge of hard cheese, a length of snare wire, and Orrin Fitch's tools. She made a fire. The smoke went up the chimney. That was the first good thing. She ate 1 biscuit and half the cheese, and she thought about what Orrin used to say when she complained that a job was too hard. The job isn't hard. You just haven't figured out which part to do first. She figured out which part to do first. By the end of the first week, she had rehung the door, packed the chimney breech with river clay she'd dug from the creek bank, and cut a piece of oilcloth from the back of her satchel lining to cover the window. It wasn't glass, but it let in light and kept out the wind, which was what mattered. By the end of the second week, she had walked the 7 miles to Harwick and back twice, once to buy a sack of cornmeal, salt pork, and dried beans with the $4.30 she'd kept sewn into her coat lining, and once to let it be known quietly that she did shoe repair. She had tacked a card to the board outside the general store. D. Crane, cobbling and leather repair. Fair prices, good work. She had written her name without a title, because she had found, in the time she'd worked alongside Orrin Fitch, that people assumed a sign without a woman's name on it belonged to a man, and a man's shop was one worth walking into. She was not being dishonest, she was being practical. The first customer came to her on a Thursday, a rancher named Albert Good who lived on a spread 5 miles up the valley. He had a pair of boots he'd cobbled himself 3 years ago badly, and they had been causing him grief ever since. He looked surprised when she opened the door. "You're the cobbler?" he said. "I am," she said. He handed her the boots. She turned them over, looked at the sole seams, pressed her thumb along the heel to feel where the leather had separated from the welt. 2 days, she said. $1.50. He nodded, slowly. All right. He came back in 2 days. He put the boots on outside her door and walked back and forth on the frozen ground and did not say anything for a moment. "Orrin Fitch work?" he finally asked. "I learned from Orrin Fitch," she said. He paid her $1.50 and tipped his hat. He told 2 other men. Those men told others. By November, she had more work than she could do in a full day, which meant she was up before light and working by lamplight at night. Her hands moving through the familiar motions. Awl, thread, mallet, last, while the snow began to come down outside the window and the wood stove ticked in the corner. She was not comfortable. She was not warm enough. She was not eating as well as she should have been. But she was surviving, and there is a particular kind of pride that comes with that. Quieter than happiness, but more solid. The kind that stays. It was Albert Good who told her about the floor. He had come back in December with a harness that needed stitching, not cobbling work, but close enough. And she was not in a position to turn away paying jobs. He sat on the stump she used as a visitor's chair while she worked, and he looked around the cabin with the assessing eye of a man who has spent his life evaluating what things are worth. "You know what this place is?" he said. She did not look up from the harness. "Old surveyor's cabin," my stepfather said. "Surveyor," Albert snorted. "That's one word for him. Name was Clement Vargas. Came out here about 12 years ago, said he was doing land surveys for the territorial government, which he was, some. But that wasn't all he was doing." Delia kept stitching. "This cabin used to be a stopping point," Albert said. "Back before the railroad came through proper. Men moving things up and down the valley used to leave things here. For safe keeping." "What kind of things?" Albert looked at the floor. "The packed dirt floor, smooth and hard with years of use. Don't know exactly. But Clement Vargas was a careful man. Built this workbench himself. Did all his own work. Didn't like people touching his floor." Delia looked at the floor. Albert left 20 minutes later and she stood in the middle of the room after he was gone and looked at the floor for a long time. Then she got down on her hands and knees and began to feel along the edges, the way Orrin had taught her to feel along a seam. Not looking for what you could see, but feeling for what was there. She found it in the corner behind the stove, a seam in the dirt. A wooden trapdoor, set so flush and packed so carefully that in the low light of the cabin it was nearly invisible. She had swept that floor a dozen times. She had never noticed. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to the stove and put another piece of wood on and made sure the door was latched and came back and worked her knife blade into the seam and lifted. "We want to be honest with you about something. When we tell you what Delia Crane found under that floor, we know it sounds like the kind of thing that happens in stories and not in life. But the truth is that the line between those two things has always been thinner than people like to admit, especially in the places where the land is hard and the winters are long and ordinary people are sometimes called upon to do extraordinary things just to get from one year to the next. What she found was this: a cavity about 3 feet deep, maybe 4 feet square, lined with flat stones. And inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord, stacked with the careful precision of a man who meant them to be found by the right person and not by the wrong one, were ledgers. 6 of them, cloth-bound, their covers marked with a stamped symbol she didn't immediately recognize. She lifted one out and opened it in the lamplight. The handwriting was small and precise. The columns were dated going back to 1872, and what they recorded was money, but not in any way she initially understood. Names she didn't recognize. Amounts. Notations in a shorthand that took her the better part of an hour to begin to decipher, sitting cross-legged on the floor with the lamp turned up as high as it would go. And then she understood. Clement Vargas had not just been surveying land. He had been surveying who owned it, and more specifically, how they had come to own it. The columns were records of payments. Payments made to a county land recorder named Seth Pruitt. Payments in exchange for altered survey records, forged boundary markers, backdated deeds. It was a system, a careful, patient, years-long system. And at the center of it, appearing in the ledgers again and again, as the primary beneficiary of every transaction, the man who had received the land, the timber, rights, the water access that the altered surveys produced, was a name she knew. Warren Gill. Warren Gill was not the most powerful man in Harwick. That was not how he operated. He was the man behind the man behind the man. The silent partner in the mill. The quiet co-signer on half the loans in the valley. The person who, when a family lost their farm, somehow managed to acquire the adjacent parcel 6 months later, at a price that no one could quite explain. He was the sort of man who was always helpful in a way that left you slightly unsure of what had just happened to you. Delia knew him by sight and reputation. She had repaired his son's school boots twice. She had watched him walk into the general store and hold court for 20 minutes without appearing to try. She sat with the ledgers until her lamp ran low, and then she banked the stove and lay down on the sleeping shelf. And she looked at the ceiling in the dark. She thought about Orrin Fitch, who had once told her, "The most valuable thing I own isn't in this shop. It's in what I know and who I am. Nobody can take that from you if you don't let them." She thought about what was under her floor. She thought about what it meant and what it could do and who it could help. She did not sleep for a long time. The thing we admire most about what Delia did next is not the courage of it, though there was courage in it. It was the patience. She did not go immediately to the sheriff, because she understood, the way that people who have grown up without power understand, that going to the wrong person with the right information can be more dangerous than saying nothing at all. She spent 3 weeks reading the ledgers, all 6 of them. She made her own notes, careful ones, cross-referencing names and dates and parcels, building a map of who had lost what and when and by what mechanism. She kept her notes in the back of the notebook she used for customer orders, interleaved with boot measurements and thread counts, so that if anyone looked at the book they would see nothing unusual. She kept working. She kept the fire going. She kept stitching and tacking and lasting and resoling. And when Albert Good came back in January with a pair of his wife's shoes, she asked him, carefully, what he knew about a man named Seth Pruitt. Albert's face changed. "Why?" he said. "I've come across some records," she said. "Land records. I'm trying to understand what I'm looking at." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Seth Pruitt used to be the county recorder. Got run out of the position 6 years ago. People said there were irregularities, but nothing was ever proven." He paused. "He works for Warren Gill now. Has for years." Delia nodded. She handed him back his wife's shoes. "Who would I talk to," she said, "if I had documentation of something illegal? Someone I could trust." Albert looked at her for a long time. "There's a federal land agent out of Helena, name of George Cutter. He's been looking into valley land claims for 2 years. Hasn't been able to get anywhere because he can't get anyone to talk. Where would I find him?" "He comes through Harwick, the 2nd Tuesday of every month. Stays at the Dunmore Hotel." The 2nd Tuesday of February was 11 days away. We won't tell you that those 11 days were easy, because they weren't. Delia went on with her work and her routine, and she did not let anything show on her face. And that was harder than the physical labor, harder than the cold, harder than the loneliness. She was 21 years old, and she was sitting on evidence that could ruin a man who had made himself a necessary part of the valley's economy. And she was very aware that the cabin she lived in was isolated, and that the trapdoor under the floor would look like nothing at all to anyone who didn't already know where to look. She was also aware, and this is important, that the ledgers were not hers. The land they documented, the parcels taken, the rights stolen, those belonged to families who were still here, still working ground they'd been gradually squeezed off of or reduced on, still paying on loans that had been structured against them from the beginning. That was what mattered. Not her. Not what happened to her. The 2nd Tuesday of February, she walked the 7 miles to Harwick in a snowstorm, with the ledgers wrapped in oilcloth inside her satchel. Orrin's satchel, the old brown one, the brass clasp worn smooth. And she went to the Dunmore Hotel and asked for George Cutter. He was a thin man in his 40s, with the tired, careful look of someone who has spent a long time trying to do a job that keeps getting harder. He looked at her when she came into the parlor, and he looked at the satchel. "Miss Crane," she said. "Delia Crane, I understand you've been looking into land claims in this valley." "I have," he said. "Sit down." She sat. She opened the satchel and took out the first ledger and placed it on the table between them. She watched his face as he opened it. She watched the careful blankness of a professional man trying not to show what he was thinking. She watched the moment when he turned to the third page and his hand stopped moving. "Where did you get these?" he said. She told him. All of it. The cabin, the floor, the surveyor named Clement Vargas, who had clearly kept these records as insurance, the connections she had traced, the names she had cross-referenced. George Cutter listened without interrupting. When she finished, he closed the ledger and looked at her across the table. "You walked 7 miles in a snowstorm," he said, "with 6 ledgers that implicate one of the most connected men in this county." "Yes," she said. "Why?" She thought about it for a moment. "Because somebody kept these records for a reason. Because Clement Vargas went to the trouble of hiding them carefully instead of destroying them, which means he meant for someone to find them and do something with them, and because the people who lost land because of what's in these ledgers, they're still here. Some of them are my customers." George Cutter looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the ledger again. "I'm going to need to take these to Helena," he said. "I'll give you a receipt, and I'll need you to give a statement." "I know," she said. "This will take time, and it may not be comfortable for you in the interim." "I've been uncomfortable before," she said. She was right that it took time, and she was right that it was not comfortable. In March, Warren Gill's son came to her cabin. He was polite. He said his father had heard she'd found some old papers belonging to a surveyor, and that his father would be very interested in purchasing them if she still had them, and that he hoped she understood there was no ill intent, just a concern about documents going astray. She told him she didn't know what he was talking about. In April, someone threw a rock through her oilcloth window. She replaced it with a piece of salvaged glass she'd traded 2 pairs of res-old boots for, and she didn't mention the rock to anyone. In May, Albert Good and 2 other men she knew began taking turns parking their wagons on the road nearest her cabin on the evenings she worked late. They didn't announce it. They didn't make a production of it. They just did it. She saw them from the window, and she understood, and she didn't say anything, because some kindnesses are most gracefully received in silence. In June, George Cutter came back from Helena with 2 other men, and Warren Gill and Seth Pruitt, and 2 other men whose names she recognized from the ledgers were arrested on federal charges of land fraud and records falsification. The valley did not erupt into drama. It went quiet in the way that places go quiet when something that has been wrong for a long time is finally corrected. A particular settling, like a house that has been leaning into a bad wind and now, slowly, begins to straighten. The legal process took the better part of 2 years. We won't walk you through all of it. What matters is the outcome, and the outcome was this. 43 land parcels were resurveyed using the original records from the ledgers, and 31 families received corrections to their deeds. Timber and water rights that had been quietly absorbed into Gill's holdings were returned. Seth Pruitt testified against Gill in exchange for a reduced sentence, and then left the county and was not heard from again. Warren Gill's attorney argued that his client had operated in good faith, relying on documents provided by others. The federal judge did not appear to find this convincing. Delia Crane gave her statement. She answered questions for 2 days, sitting in a chair in the county courthouse, and she answered them clearly and without dramatics, and at the end the federal prosecutor looked at her across the table and said, "Miss Crane, do you understand what it is you've done?" She thought about that. "I found something," she said, "that needed to be found, and I gave it to the right people." "That's one way to put it," he said. She took Orrin's satchel and walked back to the cabin on the North Fork and went back to work. There is a coda to this story, and we think it is the best part. By the time the legal proceedings were settled, Delia Crane had been running her cobbling and leather repair business out of that single-room cabin for 3 years. Her reputation in the valley had grown. Partly because of her work, which was as good as Orrin Fitch's had ever been, and in some respects better, because she was younger and her hands were steadier, and she had kept practicing every day since she was 15, and partly because people knew what she had done. In the winter of 1889, Albert Good and several of the families whose land had been restored came to her with a proposition. There was a storefront opening up on Harwick's Main Street. The previous tenant had been a harness maker who was moving to Billings. The space had a good wood floor, 2 large windows, and a back room that would serve as a workshop. "We'd like you to take it," Albert said. "Proper shop, Your name on the window. I can't afford the rent, she said. 6 months covered, he said. Call it a thank you for what you did. She looked at him. She was 24 years old. She had come up the North Fork Road with $4.30 and a canvas sack and a dead man's tools, and she had built something out of what she had been given, which was very little, and what she knew, which was enough. I'll pay it back, she said. Every cent. We know you will, Albert said. And he smiled. That was never really the point. The shop opened on a Thursday in March, and it did good business from the first week. She painted the sign herself in the careful block letters Orrin Fitch had used on his own shop window back in the years when she used to sit on the stool in the corner and watch him work. D. Crane, cobbling and leather work, fair prices, good work. She kept the satchel on a hook by the door, the brass clasp, worn smooth, the leather, dark with age and use. On the days when the work was hard or the hours were long, she'd look at it and think of Orrin. Not with grief exactly, but with the particular gratitude you feel towards someone who gave you something worth keeping. Not money, not a building, not a name. Just the knowledge of how to do one thing well, and the belief that doing it well was enough. We think about that sometimes, about how the tools we carry shape the lives we're able to build. Not the tools we're born with, necessarily, but the ones we're given by the people who saw something in us before we could see it ourselves. Delia Crane walked 7 miles in a February snowstorm, with evidence that could bring down a corrupt man, tucked inside a satchel that had once belonged to a cobbler who left it to her because he believed she was the right person to have it. She was. We want to ask you something before we go. Think about the people in your own life. The Orrin Fitches, the quiet teachers, the ones who handed you something and didn't make a fuss about it. What did they give you that you're still carrying? And what have you done with it? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone.